2nd of February 2024. This is just one of those let's talk Skidmarks of mine, and in this one I'm doing it on purpose in English because there are people that should take note that are not Afrikaans speaking people. There has been a lot of debating and books were written about the difference between Afrikaners and boere. And last night somebody sent me a link to a document published by a Canadian guy that lived here in South Africa, and he wrote the following. And from all the things that I have read, I think that this guy has managed to show the distinction between Afrikaners and boere very well. Now you must excuse me, I'm going to be reading a document, so bear with me. Ethnic differences between Boers and Afrikaners. That debate again. I place this again and in English so everyone can understand it. Yes, the Boervolk understands English. The following, I hope, will be informative explanation contrasting and outlining the difference between the once notable historical differences between the two main white Afrikaans-speaking groups, as I have discerned from spending time examining the history of the groups and the region in question. The term Afrikaner and the term Boer once denoted two distinct groups in the not-so-distant past. While it is easy for many people of Boer descent to not realize the difference due to the fact that they were often brought up to think of themselves as Afrikaners. The fact of the matter is that there is indeed a valid and poignant difference between the two terms, since it relates to two distinct cultural groups. The Afrikaners conditioned the Boers to view themselves as Afrikaners, as well in the wake of the devastation of the Anglo-Boer War, when most Boers were destitute and looking for work in the cities. This left them rather vulnerable to the Cape-based Afrikaners, political maneuvering which ultimately would co-opt the Boers in a political context. It's important to take note of what he is saying here. The Boers are the descendants of those semi-nomadic, early migrating farmers who were known as the trek Boers, who first trekked or moved away from the Cape Colony and colonial society in general during the late 1600s and 1700s, due to their poorer status and the fact that they found the autocratic VOC regulations intolerable. This act alone would be the essence of the difference between the Boers and the Afrikaner, who had remained in the Cape Colony, as it was the beginning of a cultural gulf which stretches back to Europe before they were brought to the Cape. The Afrikaans historian Brian de Tooy states on page 1 of his book on the Boer diaspora, which went to East Africa following the Anglo-Boer War, that the Boers were formed on the frontiers of white settlement and on the outskirts of civilization, while the Afrikaners in the Cape, on the other hand, were not. This is the crux of why the Cape Afrikaners were pro-colonial and the Boers were anti-colonial. This was a trait which would later play a significant role during the Second Anglo-Boer War, when a significant number of the trek Boers settled down on the Eastern Cape frontier by late 1700s. They became known as the grensboere or border farmers. It was from the grensboere and a number of still trek Boers that the vast majority of the voortrekkers would later came from, after the local Boers were tired of British imperialist colonial oppression, causal attacks, constant frontier wars, and growing land shortages during what was later called the Great Trek. with all this was happening, while all this was happening among the Boer communities on the frontier, most of the white community in the Cape had remained in the Cape Colony and were often known as the Cape Dutch, and were loyal to the colonial powers and often ridiculed the frontier Boers, for whom they had little affinity, for viewing them as semi-barbaric ruffians. The Cape Dutch, the forerunners to the Afrikaners, often attempted to exert nominal control over the track Boers, notably with the establishment of the frontier towns of Swellendam and Graafrenet. It was in these two towns that the Boers declared their first republics in 1795, whereupon they adopted the red, white and blue horizontal tricolour flag taken from the Batavian Republic flag. This motif would later be found in numerous other Boer Republican flags, while the orange and white and blue horizontal tricolour flag of the Cape Dutch run VOC Cape would later find its way into the South African flag in 1927 under the Prime Ministership of the Cape Colony-born IEE Cape Dutch Afrikaner JBM Hertzog. The first freedom struggle the Boers ever had was against the administration of the Cape Dutch, i.e. the Proto-Afrikaners, or rather the people who would later coin the term Afrikaner and whom used it in a political context. This is most significant since it demonstrates that the Cape Dutch Afrikaners have never wanted freedom, in contrast to the Boers who have always wanted freedom in Africa and often fought or worked against the freedom of the Boers, just as they would again later do during the Second Anglo-Boer War, when numerous Cape colonist Afrikaners fought against the Boers on the side of the British. Now there might even be some Boers who think that all this is in the past and that they are now all one big Afrikaner group, but this is wrong on a number of fronts. First, let's consider where the term Afrikaner came from and what purpose it served. The term Afrikaner was first loosely used in 1707 when Hendrik Bibau, a member of the local white Proto-Afrikaans speaking community in the Cape, was in court and declared that he was an Afrikaner, meaning that he was an African and was no longer from Europe. During this time, all of the white settlers and the mixed race persons in Africa were referred to Afrikaners and later Afrikaners, but this was simply a geographical label, as it was applied to white people in general who were born in Africa regardless of which cultural group they were a part of. How it came to be used to denote a specific cultural group and become politicized occurred much later in 1875, when a group of Cape Dutch intellectuals in the Cape Colony decided to start a language rights group aimed at getting official recognition for their language, which they began to call Afrikaans, after the African continent. Remember that at this exact same time the Boers were independent in their own republics in the north and spoke their own dialect of this language, which they called die taal or Boertaal, which historians have classified as Eastern Border Afrikaans, since the Boers dialect of the Afrikaans developed on the northern and eastern frontier, away from the Cape colonist Afrikaners and their dialect. The term Afrikaner was first used in a political context by these Cape colonist people who began to call themselves Afrikaners and after the language they spoke, all at a time when the Boer people had long since been established and were mainly living in their own independent world-recognized republics in the north. Therefore, in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, and as early as the 1700s, when the Boers' ancestors trekked out of the Cape Colony, there were two distinct and identifiable white Afrikaans-speaking different dialects groups in southern Africa, one in the Cape Colony and some who moved northwards after the gold rush, who called themselves Afrikaners and were the descendants of the pro-colonial Cape Dutch, and the other group, the anti-colonial Republican independent-orientated Boers living in the northern and eastern Cape frontier and within their own independent republics in the north, descendants of the Trekboers, Grensboere and the Voortrekkers. President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal Republic, who referred to himself as a Boer, was wary of the Cape Afrikaners and did not want them coming to his republic, Transvaal, as he viewed them as being too pro-British. He would often recruit people from Holland to fill certain government positions, as he felt that they would be more loyal to the Transvaal Republic than the Afrikaners. The Cape Afrikaners were often influenced by the British colonial power. After the Boers were conquered by the British and became incorporated into the British created macro-state of South Africa, a number of these Boers even attempted to restore their former republics by force of arms in 1914, when General de Wet and de la Rey and some other notable Boer generals staged a rebellion to the South Africa government during World War I. This rebellion was triggered by when Prime Minister Louis Botha's government decided to enter on the side of the British during the war. This led to an outrage among many Boers, since it was less than 15 years after the British killed close to 70% of the total Boer child population in the concentration camps. The rebellion was put down by force and its leaders were shot or jailed and banned from participating in politics. So how in the world did the Boers become conditioned to also later view themselves as Afrikaners? You might be asking. In short, three-word response: war, propaganda, and politics. After the devastation of the Anglo-Boer War, of which a number of Afrikaners fought against the Boers on the side of the British, when many Boers had to move to the cities to find work, they often encountered Afrikaners who would exert their political influence over the poorer Boers. But many Boers still remained culturally intact and even had their own organizations. This is where the disastrous effect of Afrikaner nationalism comes in. During the 1930s, the Afrikaner Broederbond and the Afrikaner nationalists, which were one and the same, worked hard to assimilate the Boers into the Afrikaner fold, as the Afrikaner nationalists viewed the Boers as a political threat to their planned hegemony of South Africa. After the Boer-led Rand Rebellion was put down by violent force, even complete with the South African Party government bombing Johannesburg in 1922, the Afrikaner nationalists worked overtime to politically incorporate the Boers under the Afrikaner banner, of which Cape-based Afrikaners would control. One of the first things they did was to create the color bar laws, which reserved certain jobs for white people, as the main grievances of the Boer mine workers was that they did not like having their wages being undercut by the important and cheap Bantu labor. This effectively started to acclimatize the Boers to the Afrikaner nationalists by getting them hooked onto a dimension of the apartheid platform, though it should be noted that apartheid was started by the British colonial administration, particularly the horizontal oppressive features, and was only expanded upon by the Afrikaner nationalists, in which they also envisioned and attempted to turn the Bantu reserves into independent states. 4 were in fact granted outright independence, but were only ever recognized by South Africa and each other, but not by the world. Another more effective method the Afrikaners used to co-opt the Boers was by invoking Boer history, most notably the Great Trek. Notice how the Cape colonist-born Cape Dutch Afrikaner D.F. Malan, the National Party Prime Minister, was able to this to great effect, notably during the Great Trek reenactment ceremonies at the Voortrekker Monument inauguration. This single event alone was definitely one of the convenient tools that the Afrikaner nationalists used to co-opt the Republican Boers, which in turn let the Boers guard down, erroneously as it would turn out, that their Boer interests were looked after by teaming up with the Cape-based Afrikaners under the banner of Afrikaner nationalism, which was an extension of British imperialism in many ways, as the macro state set up by the British with the South Africa Act of 1909 was now being run by a Cape-based Afrikaans-speaking regime, which was recruited as a surrogate colonial power. D.F. Malan was nothing more than a political opportunist. Interesting how Jacob Zuma, a political opportunist himself, is attempting to do a similar thing in modern times by attempting to appeal to the Boer and Afrikaners, just as Malan was able to successfully do, who used the centennial of the Great Trek to promote his political agenda and the establishment of Afrikaner nationalism, which sought as part of its goal to expropriate and subjugate the Boer nation under the tutelage of the anti-republican Cape-based Afrikaners. Malan was even opposed to the republican aspirations of the Boers, even attempting to prevent the Boer descendant Hans Strydom from succeeding him as Prime Minister, as he favored N.C. Havenga, the former leader of the Afrikaner Party, who joined the National Party in 1951. According to one of the past guests of the Hello Africa segment of the Right Perspective radio program, Teensklute of Boervolk Radio, Strydom was even talking about restoring the Boer republics, as there was considerable support among the Boers during the 1940s and 50s for this. Strydom interestingly later died in office under mysterious circumstances and was succeeded by none other than Hendrik Verwoerd, the Dutch-born architect of Grand Apartheid, and who would later turn South Africa into a nominal republic, which would further offset and blunt Boer aspirations for independence within their own republics. Therefore, by 1950s, most Afrikaans-speaking people were conditioned to view themselves as Afrikaners, even though this is technically incorrect, since for Boers to do so, they are basically giving up their own unique identity and allowing themselves to be represented and dominated by the numerically larger Afrikaners, who have often historically worked against the interest of the Boers. This is the main reason why it is woefully wrong for Boers to think of themselves as Afrikaners. Consider the following examples. In Canada, there are Quebec and Acadians. Both are French-speaking Canadians, but no one would ever call the Acadians French Canadians, since there is a term which is applied to the French speakers in Quebec and Ontario. Similarly, there are distinctions between Croats and the Serbs in Europe, even though both groups speak the same language, though different dialects of Serbo-Croatian. Croats speaking a dialect called Croatian, and the Serbs speaking a dialect called Serbian. just as the Boers and Afrikaners speak, or at least use to a larger extent, different dialects of what came to be called Afrikaans. The difference between the Romanian and Moldovan is another example of different culture, ethnic groups speaking different dialects of a similar or closely related language. The problem among the white Afrikaans speakers is that the Afrikaners were able to effectively dominate and overshadow the Boers, perhaps not too unlike how the Serbs once did in the former Yugoslavia. But it appears that the Afrikaners were much better at conditioning Boer identity out of the public sphere, only to be used as a convenient political prop to bolster and advance the agenda of the Cape-based Afrikaner nationalists. This is why many Boers do not want to be viewed as Afrikaners, since this makes them a minority within the Afrikaner designation. It makes the Cape-based Afrikaner the center of power. The Afrikaners of Cape Dutch descent outnumber the Afrikaners of Boer descent, making any union between Afrikaner and Boer always coming to the detriment of the Boers. This means that anti-Boer Afrikaners could and often do represent the entire Afrikaner group making decisions which could be inimical to the Boers, rather like what often happened in apartheid era South Africa when Boers were outvoted by the Afrikaners. Sort of like how liberal leading states often make decisions inimical to the local conservatives because the given state's left and center leadership makes the political decisions affecting the entire population of the state and marginalizing persons with right of center inclination. The Cape Dutch Broederbond, which was the driving force behind Afrikaner nationalism, the National Party, apartheid rewrote the history of the Boers, turning them into Afrikaners, retroactively as part of a rhetorical device in order to co-opt the Boers, their history and their inheritance. Therefore, the history they wrote would often refer to Afrikaners instead of Boers, which is a common error still copied by contemporary authors, without realizing that they are promoting the Afrikaner nationalist propaganda and skewed version of the past. The well-known Afrikaans historian Herman Gilomea was one of those who played an integral part in the continued perpetuation of this myth by covering up or derisively downplaying the distinct and separate history of the Boer folk. The late Boer patriot Robert van Tonder of the Boerestaatparty was one of those who was most insistent that the Boers are a different nation to the Cape-based Afrikaners and was calling for the restoration of the Boer republics as early as 1961. The same year that Hendrik Verwoerd turned South Africa into a so-called republic, which was merely an ongoing farce of the Union of South Africa. Furthermore, TRP called Henry Pinkham is exactly right when he points out that the Boers can only achieve freedom as a folk, since if they try to do it while still attached to the Cape-based Afrikaners, the Boers will obviously get nowhere. The Cape-based Afrikaners, particularly its leadership, still to this day like nothing better than to keep the Boers on their Afrikaner reservation. Also, the world remembers the new colonial role that the Afrikaners played at the behest of the British and their puppets, namely Botha and Smits, who put them in control in the first place, and their disastrous, though often exaggerated, legacy, while the Boers played only a marginal role as they had hardly anything to do with the implementation of apartheid and were never high on the ranks of the political order. Therefore, going forward as Boers will only help their cause even more. particularly among the rest of the world, since the Boers were recognized the world over before and during the Anglo-Boer War. The Boer republics themselves were recognized by the various European governments and American government, and the cause of Boer independence was supported the world over. Now it would be one thing if the difference between Afrikaner and Boer was just semantics, as one guest erroneously ignorantly put it, but different terms referring to the same people. This could even be true to an extent vis-à-vis those Boers or Boer descendants who are also referred to themselves as Afrikaners due to the conditioning. But the fact of the matter is that most Afrikaners are of Cape Dutch descent, since people of Boer descent comprise only about not much more than a third of the total white Afrikaans-speaking population. Furthermore, the term Afrikaner originally referred to those colonial Cape Dutch people who often worked against Boer interests, and as such, these two terms in fact refer to two different and distinct peoples. One poster on a forum once said that the Cape-based Afrikaners, the former Cape Dutch, are nothing more than Afrikaans-speaking English people. Rather poignant observation, since the Cape-based Afrikaners have virtually the same cosmopolitan neo-colonial liberal outlook as most of the English speakers have, which is in sharp contrast to the more rustic, rural, anti-colonial and conservative outlook of the Boers. Therefore, even if the Boers and Afrikaners were to achieve independence in a common state, as they had in apartheid-era South Africa along with the English speakers, which the notion of dismissing the difference between Afrikaner and Boer would lead to the Boer people still not have the full self-determination that they most seek, as they would still be under the political control and suzerainty of the Cape-based Afrikaners, who often do not share their political outlook or culture, nor even same history, i.e. the tracking theme past, the various freedom struggles, nor the frontier origins which shaped and defined them. I find this quite informative, and I'll put the link to the article in the description below the video so that you can go and read the article yourself. There's a lot of information to digest in there. But it is interesting that the remarks the guy make at several places, how the Boer has been outmaneuvered by the Afrikaners. And we saw it again today. We saw it at Groblersdal, where that Afrikaner political group abandoned the Boere that was in trouble in Groblersdal, and today in Centurion, at that party offices, they bluntly refused to take the letters of objections from the Boere that gathered at that office. That is how these Afrikaners have been treating the Boere as long as I'm alive. Always dismissive. And it is time for the Boere to wake up and understand this, make peace with the fact that you are a Boer, and then again, also make peace with the fact that we are a minority. But think back to Blood River, a minority. And that's only one instance in the history. There are many like it. Please give me a like and a subscribe and share the thing. Thank you for your support.